I'm Brian Kanof, and I was born in Portsmouth Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, Virginia, in May the 18th, 1949. My dad was active duty Army officer, and at the time, the Coast Artillery, which was his branch, they were in all the naval bases. So he and my mom had three children. All three were born in three different naval hospitals. So, but I live in El Paso, Texas, and I am a career photojournalist. I was a commissioned officer. My entire time on active duty and reserve was as a commissioned officer. I was commissioned out of ROTC in 1971. I was in ROTC at the University of Texas at El Paso, and I was in the commissioning class in May of 1971.
And what made you choose to go that route?
Well, my father was an Army officer. I thought I'd give the family business a try. Dad was a 30-year man. The reason we were in El Paso is because Fort Bliss is in El Paso, and Coast Artillery became Air Defense Artillery. So that's where all the missiles were. And many of them still are, is Fort Bliss. So Dad was stationed at Fort Bliss three different times in his career. So El Paso's home. So I went to the University of Texas at El Paso because it was the hometown university, and that was fine with me. I was okay with going to the local, state university. It was okay.
Can you describe what the ROTC program is?
Well, the ROTC program is Reserve Officer Training Corps, and what it does is that you learn. It's also called military science in universities and colleges, and it's a military science department. Junior ROTC is the high school level, where you put on a uniform once a week and learn your basic military, schooling. When you're in ROTC in college or university, you learn basically the basics of military. You learn the logistics, and you learn the structure of the military, also drilling and ceremonies, the old 22-5, which is the field manual for all of those things. It's, you learn how to salute and properly stand at attention and do all of the basic things that every soldier needs to know before actually picking out a career course in the military. You'll do that in your last couple of years in ROTC, and because I was a journalism student, a journalism major, and a photographer. The reason I was a journalism major is because the journalism department is where the darkrooms were. So I didn't care so much about journalism as I did photography, because I had been a photographer since I was 15 years old. I learned my photography early when my father was stationed in Rome, Italy, at the embassy. Dad was a military attaché, and I learned photography from one of those crazy Italian paparazzi that you heard so much about, but the old La Dolce Vita years in the 60s. That's how I learned my photography, a guy named Mauro Cotta. I just took a menial job as an assistant to schlep this and schlep that, and learned by watching what he did. And that's how I learned my photography, basically. And of course, it clicked, it worked for me. It was something that I was just made to do. Unlike almost everything else in my life, I took to it immediately and became good at it, and that's led me through life. That's been my basic career, is photography. I went on active duty. I had a choice. I went on active duty, actually. The Army allowed me to go to graduate school after college. There was a relatively obscure program that allowed you to further your education. I mean, you could have a delay to active duty for educational purposes. Now, this was designed to get your degree if you didn't get it in 4 years. Well, I got my degree in 4 years. But I asked him anyway. I said, it doesn't say that. It just says, can I apply to, there was still a shooting war going on in Vietnam. And I thought, well, why, see if I can get a master's degree and push it up. Well, that's exactly what happened. I applied for it, I got it, and went to Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and got a master's in journalism with a photo emphasis. So by the time the Army was ready for me to go on active duty and go I was a Signal Corps officer. I was commissioned in the Signal Corps. That was the branch, career branch. And by the time I was finished with graduate school in May of '72, they weren't ready for me until October. So I went to Signal Officer Basic School in Fort Gordon, Georgia, and was done in January of '73, and they sent me to Fort Hood, Texas. for active duty, for my 2 years of active duty, where I was a public affairs officer for half the time, and then when I was promoted to first lieutenant, they asked me if I would be a test officer at the test directorate called MASTER, Modern Army Selected Systems Test Evaluation and Review, MASSTER. This was a facility that was set up to test all the systems that were used in Vietnam. The CAVNAV, for example, is that's these goggles that can see in the dark, night vision goggles. Those were tested, developed in that directorate. Also, unattended ground sensors, what they use on the border now, where somebody is walking between these sensors. The radio will pick up the movement of the earth or the sounds, and on somebody's computer, miles and miles away, they can see, oh, somebody's walking through the border there. Those UGS, they were called unattended ground sensors, were used in Vietnam to detect the motion of troops. And those were, I would be writing stories about them and taking pictures of them, of all these different types of systems, laser-guided missile systems, and rearming and refueling points, and run-flat tires, all these things that were developed for combat. But the military would work hand in hand with the civilian contractors in developing these for actual use. And we would, at Fort Hood, we'd put them through the rigorous simulations of war, using the 1st Cavalry Division that was stationed there at the time, and the 2nd Armored Division for manpower, driving the vehicles with these bad tires or whatever, or shooting down helicopters with these laser-guided missiles, simulated, of course. So that's what was going on. So when I was on active duty, I did that I wrote the stories and took the pictures for the first time, and then I actually ran a test myself for the second half. And then in 1974, I came back to El Paso and went to work for an ad agency.
So all that time was spent at Fort Hood, did you say?
All my active duty time was at Fort Hood, Texas. Yeah.
And then did you have a tour in Korea?
Well, I was in Korea twice, both as a reserve officer. 3 weeks both times. The first time was in 1978, when I was a member of the 383rd Quartermaster Battalion, Petroleum Pipeline Operating. And that's in Ascarity Park in El Paso County, El Paso, Texas. And this battalion, during the time of conflict, would go to a foreign country and run a pipeline, a petroleum pipeline. It's almost one of the rarest units in the military, a battalion that is tasked to run a pipeline, because it's very technical stuff. Running a pipeline and the pumps and a lab and this is a highly technical skill, and the members of the battalion learned that skill, and because it's a battalion, it had a signal shop. It had radio, and back then most of it was wire, or like telephone communication from one place to the other, draft radio or telephone. And the guys that did that worked for me. I also had a draftsman, an artist who, the guy stenciling vehicles or making signs or whatever. He worked in that shop, as did the radio and telephone operators. They worked for me, and we went to Korea in 1978, and the battalion ran that pipeline. Well, while the battalion was running the pipeline, and of course, between all the stations along the pipeline, by the way, runs from Pohang Harbor in the southern part of South Korea, where they offload the tankers, and they'll put the product, whether it's gasoline or diesel oil or JP4 fuel or whatever it is, in that pipeline, and it went up all the way to Seoul, north to Seoul. So that pipeline ran the entire length of the country. A small 8-inch pipeline owned by the South Koreans and run by the South Koreans and co-run by the U.S. Army. And for 3 weeks, we ran that pipeline. And my guys ran the switchboard in Daegu. the guys that actually worked for me. They were the switchboard operators. Giving the guys that normally did that, I don't know, they could go on vacation then, I guess. I don't know whatever they were doing, but we were on a shift. A switchboard is run 24 hours a day, and our guys had it. The 3 or 4 guys I had took a shift. So this was 1978. The entire battalion went. The mess hall went. Everyone to cook food, and the mess hall didn't cook just for us while they were there. They were cooking for Daegu, the military post in Daegu, Korea. That's what they were doing. They were integrated with the other guys that were there all the time, spelling them and learning and doing and teaching them how to make enchiladas, actually. So our best mess hall in the Army was the 383rd Quartermaster, I'll tell you. They loved to see us coming because at the last meal during our deployment was an enchilada dinner, and we brought the stuff with us. We brought the jalapenos and the cheese and everything with us from the United States to Korea, so we could the mess hall could cook the proper Mexican meal for the locals. It was great. It was always a great deal. So for that time, we just ran the pipeline, and it was the only time really that I ever carried a loaded weapon, because as an additional duty, they made me the paymaster. So when the paymaster, they hand you all this cash and a loaded .45. So you're in downtown Seoul in a military vehicle carrying a loaded .45, and that was the only time I really ever carried a loaded weapon, whether it was active duty or training. Training you carry one, but I mean not real ammunition or real gun was as the paymaster. So no, you could defend the money if somebody tried to steal it. So the government's really bad about that. They don't want people taking their hard-earned taxpayer money. So that was the 3 weeks that I was in South Korea the first time. I can tell you my second deployment was in November of 1985. By then, I was no longer a member of the 383rd Quartermaster Battalion Petroleum Pipeline Operating. I was a Green Beret. I joined the 12th Special Forces Group in the winter of 1978, and went through Special Forces training, airborne school, became airborne qualified, and then in 1980 became Special Forces qualified, and became a fully qualified Special Forces officer, also known as a Green Beret. And I served as a staff officer several different staff positions in the 7 years and 1 month that I was in the 12th group. Starting off as the S2, which is the security and intelligence officer, and I served as the S2, the S1, and the executive officer at different times. And also, I was the interim commander on 2 different occasions in between commanders. Now, back then, Special Forces has their own branch today. There is a Special Forces branch. Back then, there wasn't a Special Forces branch. It was called Branch Immaterial. In other words, it was only when you were in Special Forces, you were only there a couple of years as an officer, and then you were something else. The NCOs and the warrant officers, this was a career for them. But it's so highly specialized. Training is so expensive and takes such long to be a fully proficient medic, for example, or engineer in Special Forces, that those that operate on the team, the NCOs, enlisted NCOs and warrant officers that are actually on operational detachments or teams, very highly specialized. You don't want them showing up for 2 years and going somewhere else. But it was perceived at the time of inception that an officer's an officer, and you can command. You learn it. You learn the skill of commanding troops, and then you can command those guys, and then you go and do something else. But the Army learned eventually that didn't make sense. That it was a good idea to have Special Forces as a career, and so that you could go through the different Special Forces specialties in command and stay with Special Forces your whole career. And that's the way it exists today. But then, because I was not a combat branch officer, I was not in the artillery, the armor, or the infantry, I wasn't, so they would not make me a commander. I was in the Signal Corps. So anyway, combat support and combat service support were not looked upon as being that, hardcore combat. I mean, it was not true, but I mean, that was the perception at the time. So they certainly weren't going to allow a signal officer to be the commander of a Green Beret company. Fine, that's okay. But that was then. And when the time came to transition and became most of the officers in reserves that wanted to stay in Special Forces did transition into the branch. So in 1985, B Company, 2nd Battalion, 12th Special Forces, headquartered in El Paso, Texas, on Fort Bliss, was sent to Korea to train the Korean Special Operations Forces. This was in the mountains below Seoul, where the airborne school is, and the special. Their equivalent of the Special Forces, their equivalent of the Green Berets, where they're headquartered. And it was a joint operation called Operation Full Eagle, and we ran a segment of that operation for 3 weeks. And we were involved in the actual hands-on training of the South Korean Special Operations Forces. The Korean experience was a unique experience for us, and it was even more so for the Koreans. I was tasked with the information usually given to an executive officer or the S2 of, if you're going to go do something and go somewhere, you need to kind of find out what to anticipate and what to expect. Well, I believe it was either the 5th or the 7th group had done this training the year before. I believe at the time it was an annual, or it was an exercise. Maybe, I don't know if it happened every year, but it had happened before and it happened after. They're all into the psychology business, where, you know, like, we showed up and the food is exotic to us, you know. And we started eating the food, and people, it was really hot and spicy, and so the guys would say, "Oh no, I ate on the plane." And then for 3 weeks they had our ass, because, you know, here they'd laugh and they'd point at our stomach, you know, and laugh and stuff like that, because we couldn't take the food, and we basically embarrassed ourselves, because here they put out this entire banquet for us after we got off the plane, and nobody ate anything because it was too hot, it was too spicy, and it was just stuff they weren't used to eating. Well, using that information, I briefed the guys. I said, look, here's what's going to happen. They eat old mess hall style, World War II Army mess hall style, where they put the bowls of food on a table. And they're going to sit you down, and they're going to expect you to eat with them, and you better eat that stuff they put in front of you, because if not, you're going to be embarrassed and we're going to be embarrassed. And for the next 3 weeks, they're going to own you, because they'll tease you about the fact that you did not respond to their hospitality. You dissed them. Well, we had two big things going for us. First of all, everybody in our unit, not everybody to the man, but almost everybody, is from the neighborhood. We're talking about Mexican Americans, guys that, you know, eat hot food on a daily basis. And also, at the time, I worked for an advertising agency, and one of our clients was Bruce Foods. They're the makers of Louisiana hot sauce. And a friend of mine that worked in my same department at the ad agency, her husband was the manager of the plant here in El Paso. And you could get these little 3-ounce bottles of Louisiana hot sauce to throw in your rucksack. He gave me a case of them, 144 bottles Louisiana hot sauce. So when our guys arrived at the mess hall, getting in off the plane, everybody sat down. These guys are pulling Louisiana hot sauce, jars of jalapeno peppers out of their rucksacks, and eating everything in sight. Well, from the year before, the Koreans knew we weren't going to eat anything, so they didn't prepare as much food as they normally would have. So we ate all their food and then said, we're hungry, where's the rest? So for the next 3 weeks, we had them. But it was a learning experience for both sides, because all of the operations now, being in Special Forces, the maneuver element is it's a team concept, where you put a team in the field. And each one of the teams that went into the field on this operation were split teams. Half of each team were Koreans, and half of each team was Americans. the the situation was such that each of these split teams was either commanded by a Korean, and the second in command, the executive officer, was an American, or vice versa. Half the teams were commanded by Koreans, and half the teams were commanded by Americans. And they maneuvered. They went on basically 10-day field exercises and given missions and that sort of thing. But the Koreans didn't speak any English, and the Americans didn't speak any Korean. At least that's the way it was told to us. As it turns out, we found out right away that the Koreans all took English in school. So they may have not been able to converse in English well, but if you're talking to one another, they probably understood exactly what you were saying. And we knew that. So we were very careful not to, we told our guys, don't say anything because you don't think that they're going to understand it. So this is, once again, this is just a matter of preparing to go into the field under simulated, if not real, conditions. And we say real condition is that fact. We were also told ahead of time that it's very possible that one or more of the members of those teams is actually a North Korean. The infiltration is there, and you could wake up dead. So there was always that possibility, and precautions were taken in case of there being an incident. That's about as specific as I can get, but everybody was conscious of the scenarios that might happen in this type of training. So everybody was thoroughly briefed on what to do, rally points, and certain things that were done. So it was real training, as real a training in peacetime could be. But as you know, Korea is still a war zone. They never did sign that, final paperwork that ceased the war to exist. It's still in a state of limbo, so to speak. And that's why I was asked to come here. I was told that if you did anything in Korea for any length of time, you were in the Korean War, basically. I didn't even know that until relatively recently. When I was there in 1978, I took a taxi cab ride in a Hyundai. I'd never even heard of a Hyundai. Now, it's the sponsor of the Sun Bowl in El Paso. It's the Hyundai Sun Bowl. I mean, it's as common to drive a Hyundai as it is a Datsun, or Nissan, I should say, a Honda or a Toyota. Back then, they didn't exist in the United States. They were not imported. So I found out what the Korean automobile. I rode in a Hyundai, a Daewoo. There were several different manufacturers of automobiles in Korea. I'm a car guy, and I was interested in it. I found out I didn't even know these things existed, and I was able to. This is the first time in '78. Never even saw a civilian vehicle when I was there in '85. But the way that they operated was completely different because of the situation in Seoul, for example. When you drive a car, you drive with the inside. Back then, anyway, you drove with the dome light on inside. And at night, when you came to a stoplight or a stop sign, you turn your headlights off. I mean, there's certainly you didn't want an airplane to be able to spot you and shoot you. I guess, I don't know, but let's just say that they were still sensitized to the Korean War and did things differently than they did. I don't think it's that way any longer, but at that time in the mid '70s, it was. So I mean, the culture was different. I love the food. I love the people. It's a beautiful country. Just beautiful country. Every chance I got, I went out. I walked, and took in the culture. The Japanese during World War II completely dewooded and deforested that country. They took all of the wood out, all the trees out of that country, and used them for their own purposes. And so there was a huge reforestation, and seems like they were planting trees all the time, and it was a big deal, to plant trees, and we were involved in that, whenever you go into a foreign country, unlike certain people that go when you're in special forces, you try to absorb the culture, you try to become part of it, you try to understand. If you can't understand the day-to-day life of the person you're trying to help, how can you help them? You have to understand their motivations and what makes them tick, and who they are and what they are, rather than just being an outsider. You're never going to be an insider, but you can be sensitized to their plight and who they are, so that you can help these people. Because that's what special forces is. It's not you just don't go break things and kill people. You're frequently tasked upon doing things like teaching them how to cultivate their land, or how to purify their water, or sanitize, or health, things like this. So the second time I went, the perspective was different than the first time I went.
When did you retire from the military?
91. I exited the military in 1991. I had a bad parachute accident in 85 in training. We were in another exercise called Ocean Venture, but this was strictly Americans, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all of them. Ocean Venture in Florida, and I had a parachute accident, and I had to have surgery for it, and I recovered, but I just I didn't want. I aged out of special forces. In other words, in a company-sized unit, the commander of a special forces unit is a major. There's only one major. There's only one commander. And when I was promoted to major, and I was a signal officer, not a special forces officer, I couldn't become the commander. So, and I didn't want to go and there was nothing else for me in El Paso except being an instructor in the USAR school or something. And being self-employed, I just didn't like being out of town a lot, and I had a young family at the time. I just thought, you know what, that's fine. I'll just retire. And at 20 years after my commissioning date in 91, I retired officially as a major.
And what have you done since?
Well, the same thing I've always done. I have a couple of businesses. I have a photography company here in El Paso. I do all kinds of commercial photography and aerial photography. And I also own a tequila company. I would suggest and even urge young people, women and men both, to consider the military as a place, as a continuation of their education. They're doing something important for their country. Whether you go to combat, I'm not talking about having to go to combat or anything. You're filling a need, and you're learning a skill, and the educational. I mean, the computer skills that are learned on the military side are amazing compared to what you learn civilian. You can take those computer skills that you learn in the military. I mean, how do you think they fly those drones, for example? Everything's computerized. And you learn these computer skills, these specific computer skills that you can translate into the civilian world instantly and make really good money at it. And instead of paying for your education, you're getting paid for your education. So it's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned to give the military a try. And like I say, you don't have to put paint on your face and carry a gun to be in the military. Such a small fraction of those who are in the military are in any kind of a combat situation. And I urge those that haven't really set a course in life yet to give the military a try. It's amazing what percentage of those that do are really, really grateful that they did. And you're not signing your life away. You're signing a relatively brief contract for your time and your energy, and you're getting paid for it.